The most famous sentence ever written about Phineas Gage, that the accident left him no longer Gage, wasn't written down until 20 years after it happened, by a doctor, quoting what other people said they remembered. That one fact should bother you because almost everything you think you know about this man rests on it. Here's what we are sure of. In 1848, a railroad foreman turns his head in a Vermont rock cut to say one ordinary sentence. A spark jumps. A 43-inch iron rod goes through the front of his brain and lands yards behind him. He should not survive. A few minutes later, he's sitting up, talking. And from that moment, almost everything else about him becomes an argument. You've almost certainly met Gage before. The rod through the head, the steady foreman who supposedly woke up a monster. It's one of the founding stories of brain science, repeated in nearly every intro psychology class on Earth. But the story has a secret, and it isn't a gory one. The actual evidence, what he was like before, what changed, how much, for how long, would fit on a few index cards. One country doctor's notes, a short medical report, a skull. That is nearly the whole archive. So the real mystery isn't how a man survived an iron through the brain. It's how so little became so certain. The mechanics were mundane, which is what makes them unsettling. Drill a hole in rock, pour in blasting powder and a fuse, then seal the charge with sand so the force goes into the stone instead of back up the hole. On September 13, 1848, near Cavendish, Vermont, that sealing step seems to have failed. Gage, 25, the blasting foreman trusted with the most dangerous work on the line, tamped the charge with his custom iron. Spark met powder. The rod entered below his left cheekbone, passed behind the eye, and exited the top of his skull. We won't linger on the wound. What matters here is what he had left, because what he had left was astonishing. Dr. John Martin Harlow reached a patient who should have been beyond speech and found him talking. Gage was treated through infection, swelling, and weeks of real danger, and he physically recovered. In 1850, the Harvard surgeon Henry Jacob Bigelow examined him and presented the case as proof that even a catastrophic brain injury could be survived. That's the part everyone keeps. But stay with me, because the harder puzzle here isn't the blood, it's the evidence and how little of it there really is. Gage survived the rod, then he had to survive everyone who wanted to use him. Here is the sentence that made him immortal. In an 1868 report, 2 decades after the accident and after Gage himself was dead, Harlow wrote that the people who knew him said he was no longer Gage. The balanced, capable foreman was now, as Harlow relayed it from employers and acquaintances, fitful, profane, impatient of restraint, unable to hold to a plan. It is a haunting line. It is also retrospective and second-hand. A doctor, years later, reporting what others told him about a change they believed they had seen. That is not a knock on Harlow, who was careful for his time. It is a warning about the foundation. The most quoted fact in the Gage legend is a memory of a memory, and the rebuilding started almost immediately. Among the first to seize on Gage were the phrenologists, followers of the now discredited idea that character could be read from the bumps of the skull. On their charts, the rod's path ran straight through regions they tied to qualities like benevolence and veneration. A man who had supposedly lost his kindness and his restraint fit that map a little too perfectly, so they leaned on the darkest version of his personality change. The legend of the ruined monster came partly from people who needed Gage to be ruined in exactly the places their theory predicted. Then the same patient was turned the other way. Bigelow and others who distrusted the idea of a strictly mapped brain pointed to Gage's recovery as their evidence. If you could drive an iron through the front of a man's head and still leave him walking, talking, and working, then surely no single region could be that critical. One patient, read 2 ways. That contradiction is the tell. When the same skull is marched out to win opposing arguments, the skull isn't really the evidence. The argument is. So, take a hard look at what the archive actually holds. No diary from Gage. No psychological testing. No measured before and after of the kind any case study would demand today. We have Harlow's notes and his 2 reports, a visiting physician or 2, the skull, and the iron. That is close to all of it. And a thin file cuts both ways. It lets a confident teller draw a clean arc. 1 blast, 1 broken brain, 1 ruined man, forever. But the comforting recovery rests on almost as little hard data as the monster does. And yet there's a detail the monster version simply leaves out. Yes, for a while Gage was a spectacle. He sat for portraits holding his iron and was shown off, even at Barnum's Museum in New York. But that isn't where his story ends. He worked around stables, and then, from about 1852, he spent close to 7 years in Chile, driving long-distance stagecoaches, before ill health brought him home around 1859. Sit with what that job demands. Punctuality, route memory, judgment under pressure, the daily handling of horses and paying passengers. Malcolm Macmillan and later historians read those years as a possible social recovery, that Gage's worst changes may have been loudest early on, and that structure and work helped him relearn some control. We can't prove the inner story, but a man holding down that job for years does not fit ruined forever. Then the tools changed, and Gage changed with them. In 1994, Hannah Damasio and her colleagues took the actual skull, measured the entry and exit, and modeled the rod's most likely path, to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, regions tied not to raw intelligence but to emotion, social judgment, and the weighing of decisions. A 19th century foreman had become a witness for a 20th century theory of the emotional brain. Then, in 2012, John Van Horn and colleagues stopped treating the wound as a single hole and treated it as a network failure, estimating Gage lost only about 4% of his gray matter, but disrupted around 11% of his white matter, the long wiring that connects regions to each other. Same skull, a fourth Gage. Step back and the pattern is almost too neat. The phrenologists found a man whose bumps had been destroyed. The skeptics found a man who showed regions don't matter. Damasio found a man who placed emotion in the frontal lobe. Van Horn found a man who revealed the brain as a network. Each generation looked into the same damaged skull and saw a reflection of its own best instrument. That is the odd hypothesis at the center of this story. Phineas Gage is less a fixed historical person than a mirror we keep polishing, the most studied, least known object in brain science. The accident was real, and something about him changed. But he also worked, traveled, drove those Chilean roads, and lived nearly 12 more years. The skull and the tamping iron sit today in Harvard's Warren Anatomical Museum, and they look like the end of a story. They are really the start of one we're still telling. This has been The Odd Hypothesis.